The pen trembled in his hand. Not from fear, not from cold, from the weight of knowing that with one signature, he would send thousands of young men to their deaths. June 5, 1944. Portsmouth, England. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat alone in his command post, staring at a piece of paper that would change the world. Outside, the rain hammered against the windows like machine gun fire. The storm that had already delayed the invasion once showed no mercy. In a few hours, he would have to make the decision that would define not just his life, but the fate of millions across Europe. The liberation of a continent rested on his shoulders, and those shoulders, for the first time in his military career, felt unbearably heavy. He thought of his mother back in Kansas. Ida Eisenhower, a pacifist who had raised her sons to believe that violence was never the answer. She had wept when he chose West Point over her dreams of him becoming an engineer or a teacher. Now here he was, about to orchestrate the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The irony wasn't lost on him. The boy from Abilene who used to help his mother tend her garden was now planning to water the beaches of France with blood. The meteorologists had given him a window, a brief break in the storm, maybe. Captain James Stagg, his chief weather officer, had stood before him hours earlier, his Scottish accent thick with tension. "I can give you 36 hours, General. Maybe 48. After that, the channel will be impassable again. 36 hours to launch the most complex military operation ever conceived. 36 hours to coordinate over 150,000 men, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft. 36 hours to begin the liberation of Europe from Nazi tyranny. Or 36 hours to send those men into a massacre. Eisenhower had already written the letter. The one that would be released if the invasion failed. He kept it folded in his breast pocket next to a photograph of his wife Mamie. "Our landings have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops," it began. "My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He had deliberately misdated it July 5th instead of June 5th. Even supreme commanders make mistakes under pressure. But this letter represented his greatest fear, that he would be remembered not as a liberator, but as the man who threw away the hopes of the free world on the beaches of Normandy. The faces haunted him. In the past weeks, he had visited training camps across southern England. He had shaken hands with paratroopers who would jump behind enemy lines in the dark. He had spoken with tank drivers who would wade through the surf under withering fire. He had looked into the eyes of 18-year-olds who had never been farther from home than the next county, now preparing to storm Hitler's Atlantic Wall. They had cheered when they saw him. They had crowded around wanting to touch his uniform to hear his voice. They believed in him. They trusted him to bring them home. How many wouldn't come back? The mathematics of war were ruthless. His planners estimated casualties could reach 10,000 on the first day alone. 10,000 sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. 10,000 telegrams that would shatter families from Maine to California. 10,000 names that would be carved into stone monuments that didn't yet exist. But the alternative was worse. Every day the Nazis remained in power. More Jews died in concentration camps. More resistance fighters were executed. More children starved under occupation. Time was not neutral. Time was the enemy. He remembered the moment he truly understood command. North Africa, 1942. His first major operation, Operation Torch. He had watched from the bridge of a ship as American soldiers waited ashore near Casablanca. Within hours, the reports started coming in. Confusion, friendly fire, units landing in the wrong places. French colonial forces that were supposed to surrender were instead fighting back. By the end of the first day, American bodies floated in the surf, and Eisenhower realized that every military decision he made would be paid for in blood. There was no such thing as a bloodless victory. There were only necessary sacrifices and unnecessary ones. His commanders were divided. Montgomery wanted to wait. The British general, hero of El Alamein, argued for postponement until conditions were perfect. "We need absolute air superiority," he insisted. "We need the Germans to be weaker. We need better weather. But when would conditions ever be perfect? When would the moment be without risk?" Patton predictably wanted to go immediately. "Give me one division," the fiery general had growled, "and I'll be in Berlin by Christmas." Both were wrong. Both were right. This was the loneliness of supreme command, to stand between competing truths and choose the path that led through darkness. Churchill had pulled him aside after the final planning meeting, the British Prime Minister who had seen the slaughter of Gallipoli in the First World War, who had watched an entire generation die in the trenches, had tears in his eyes. "I see them drowning in the Channel," Churchill had whispered. "I see the bodies floating in the tide." Even the old warrior who had faced down the Luftwaffe during the Blitz was terrified of what morning would bring. But they had no choice. Stalin was screaming for a second front. The Soviets were bleeding themselves white on the Eastern Front, losing more men in single battles than America had lost in its entire history. Every month of delay meant another million Russians dead. It meant more time for Hitler to perfect his jet fighters, his V-2 rockets, his dreams of wonder weapons that could still turn the tide. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were working on something even more terrible, a bomb that could destroy entire cities. Fantasy or reality, they couldn't afford to find out. The clock on the wall showed 0400 hours. In 6 hours, the final order would have to be given. Eisenhower stepped outside into the storm. The rain had lessened, but the wind still howled across the English countryside. In the distance, he could see the silhouettes of landing craft, dark shapes against the darker water. Somewhere out there, 175,000 men waited for his word. They had been sealed in their ships for days now, playing cards, writing letters home, trying not to think about what waited across the channel. The seasickness was terrible. The fear was worse, but not one man had asked to be excused. Not one had failed to board when ordered. He thought of his son John, fresh out of West Point, begging to be part of the invasion. Eisenhower had refused, pulling rank as both father and supreme commander. "Your mother would never forgive me," he had said. But the truth was more selfish. He could send other men's sons to die. That was duty. But he couldn't bear to send his own. Did that make him a hypocrite? Or just human? Every general throughout history had faced this contradiction, to order men to do what you wouldn't order your own family to do. A jeep pulled up. Bedell Smith, his chief of staff, emerged with a flask of coffee and fresh weather reports. "Stagg says the window is holding," Smith reported. "If we're going to go, it has to be now." Eisenhower nodded, sipping the bitter coffee. It tasted like motor oil, but it was hot, and warmth was in short supply. Around them, the machinery of invasion hummed with barely contained energy. Trucks rumbled through the darkness. Military police directed traffic with hooded flashlights. Somewhere, a soldier was singing, "I'll be seeing you." His voice carried on the wind. The question burned in his mind. Was he sending these men to victory or slaughter? The German defenses were formidable. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had spent months fortifying the beaches. Machine gun nests, artillery positions, obstacles designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft, mines by the millions. The Atlantic Wall was Hitler's masterpiece of defensive engineering. And waiting behind it, panzer divisions ready to drive any survivors back into the sea. But America had something Germany didn't. Hope. He walked among the assembled officers in the command center. Maps covered every surface. Pins marked objectives. Colored strings showed the paths of advance. It looked so clean on paper. So organized. Red arrows for the Americans at Omaha and Utah. Blue for the British at Golden Sword. Green for the Canadians at Juneau. But maps didn't show the 18-year-old from Iowa who would die in the first wave. They didn't show the medic who would be shot trying to save him. They didn't show the chaplain who would hold the hands of dying men, whispering last rites over the roar of artillery. The phone rang. It was Admiral Ramsey commanding the naval forces. "The fleet is ready, General. Every ship is in position. We can begin bombardment at 0530 hours. Nearly 7,000 vessels, the largest armada ever assembled. Battleships that had survived Pearl Harbor. Destroyers manned by crews who had hunted U-boats across the Atlantic. Landing craft piloted by kids who 6 months ago had never seen the ocean. All waiting for one man to say one word. Go. He thought of Grant at Shiloh, of Lee at Gettysburg, of Pershing at the Argonne, every American commander who had held lives in his hands. But none had held so many. None had carried the weight of not just a battle or a campaign, but the future of civilization itself. If D-Day failed, how long before America could mount another attempt? A year? 2? By then, Hitler's grip on Europe would be unbreakable. By then, millions more would be dead. The burden of command wasn't just about making decisions. It was about living with them. Every general he had studied, every great captain of history, had warned him about this moment. The moment when you realize that command isn't about glory or strategy or even victory. It's about accepting that you will send good men to die, and that their ghosts will visit you every night for the rest of your life. It's about knowing that every decision you make will be questioned by historians who never felt the weight of those lives in their hands. Outside, the storm was breaking. Stars appeared between the clouds. At 04:15 hours, Eisenhower made his decision. He turned to his staff, his face set with determination that masked the turmoil within. "Gentlemen, we'll go." 2 words that would echo through history. 2 words that launched the liberation of Europe. 2 words that sent 175,000 men into the unknown. The room erupted in controlled chaos as officers grabbed phones, relaying the order down the chain of command. Within minutes, engines roared to life across southern England. The great machine of war began to move. But Eisenhower wasn't finished. He grabbed his cap and headed for the door. "Where are you going, General?" Smith asked. "To see the boys off," Eisenhower replied. He drove to Greenham Common Airfield where the 101st Airborne was preparing to board their planes. These were the men who would jump into darkness hours before the beach landings. They would be alone behind enemy lines, scattered by wind and enemy fire, fighting to secure bridges and crossroads that the invasion needed. The paratroopers were applying war paint to their faces, mohawk haircuts and blackened skin. They looked like warriors from another age, but their weapons were thoroughly modern. Each man carried over 100 pounds of equipment, ammunition, explosives, medical supplies, maps of French countryside they had never seen, letters from home they might never answer. They joked and laughed, but Eisenhower could see the fear in their eyes. These men knew the statistics. 1 in 3 wouldn't survive the night. He moved among them, shaking hands, asking about hometowns, looking at pictures of girlfriends and wives. One young private from Texas showed him a photograph of a baby he had never met. "Born 2 weeks ago, General. I'm going to make it back to see him." Eisenhower gripped the boy's shoulder. What could he say? That statistics suggested otherwise? That the Germans would be waiting? Instead, he said, "You will, son. You will." As the paratroopers boarded their planes, one of them called out, "Don't worry, General. We'll take care of this for you." Eisenhower watched until the last C-47 disappeared into the darkness. Then he returned to his car and wept. His driver, Kay Summersby, pretended not to notice. She had driven him through 2 years of war. She had seen him angry, frustrated, exhausted, but she had never seen him cry. Not until tonight. The hours before dawn were the longest of his life. Eisenhower returned to his headquarters and waited. The naval bombardment had begun, the horizon lighting up with flashes that could be seen from the English coast. Thousands of tons of steel were falling on German positions, but were they hitting their targets? Were the defenders stunned or simply alerted? Radio silence meant no news would come for hours. The not knowing was agony. He tried to work. There were other fronts to manage: the Italian campaign, the Pacific theater, the endless logistics of keeping millions of men fed, armed, and supplied. But his mind kept returning to those beaches, to Omaha especially, where intelligence suggested the strongest defenses. The planners called it Bloody Omaha in their private conversations. They expected 40% casualties in the first wave. 4 out of every 10 men who hit that beach would be killed or wounded. At 06:30, the first fragmentary reports arrived. The paratroopers were scattered but fighting. Some units had landed miles from their objectives. Others had drowned in flooded fields, but they were causing havoc behind German lines, disrupting communications, ambushing reinforcements. The British 6th Airborne had captured Pegasus Bridge. The Americans were holding key crossroads. The surprise was working. The Germans were confused, unsure if this was the real invasion or a feint. Then came news from the beaches. Utah Beach. Light resistance. The Americans were moving inland ahead of schedule. Gold Beach. British troops advancing. Juneau. Canadians pushing through despite heavy casualties. Sword, complicated but manageable, but from Omaha, only silence. Then scattered reports of disaster. The naval bombardment had missed. The bombers had dropped their loads too far inland. The Germans were waiting. The first wave had been slaughtered. Eisenhower lit his 3rd pack of cigarettes. His hands were steady now. The decision was made. The die was cast. Whatever happened on those beaches was beyond his control. All he could do was feed in reserves, adjust the plan, and trust in the courage of common soldiers to accomplish the impossible. This was the hardest lesson of command, that after all the planning, all the preparation, victory or defeat came down to individual acts of heroism by men whose names he would never know. By noon, the picture was clearer. The invasion was succeeding, but at a terrible cost. Days later, Eisenhower walked on Omaha Beach. The sand was still stained with blood. Destroyed landing craft littered the shoreline like dead whales. Bulldozers were collecting bodies, American and German alike. The smell of death was overwhelming. This beach, just a few hundred yards of sand, had cost over 2,000 American lives. Each cross in the temporary cemetery represented a family destroyed, dreams unfulfilled, a future erased. He stopped at one grave. Private John J. Pinder, Jr., awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Despite being wounded twice, Pinder had made multiple trips under fire to deliver vital radio equipment to troops pinned on the beach. He had died ensuring others could call for help. Eisenhower knelt in the sand. How many John Pinders were there? How many heroes whose stories would never be told? How many had died believing that their sacrifice mattered? The French civilians were emerging from their ruins. Old men, women, children who had lived under Nazi occupation for 4 years. They approached the Americans with tears of joy, offering wine and flowers to their liberators. One elderly woman grabbed Eisenhower's hand and kissed it, speaking rapid French he couldn't understand. But he understood her tears. He understood the way she clutched a faded photograph. Perhaps a son killed in the resistance, a husband sent to a labor camp. This was why they had come, not for glory or empire, but for this moment, to see freedom return to faces that had forgotten how to hope. To hear church bells ring without fear. To watch children play in streets where German soldiers no longer patrolled. Every dead American on this beach had purchased this joy with their blood. It was a terrible exchange rate, young lives for old freedom, but it was the only currency that could buy liberty from tyranny. His aide approached with casualty reports. The numbers were staggering but lower than feared. Around 10,000 Allied casualties on D-Day, including 4,400 dead. The pessimistic projections had been double that. But what comfort was that to the mothers who would receive telegrams? What solace to the children who would grow up without fathers? Eisenhower had learned that in war, statistics were just another word for tragedy multiplied. He thought of his letter of failure, still in his pocket. Unneeded now, but he would keep it. A reminder of how close they had come to disaster. A reminder that success in war was often just catastrophe postponed. The beachhead was secure, but the war was far from over. Ahead lay the hedgerows of Normandy, where every field would become a killing ground. The race to Paris. The bitter winter in the Ardennes. The final push into Germany itself. How many more D-Days would there be before it ended? Months turned to years. Paris was liberated. The Rhine crossed. Germany invaded. And finally, in May 1945, Eisenhower stood in a small schoolhouse in Reims, France, watching German generals sign their unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The crusade he had led had succeeded. But the cost had been beyond imagination. Over 400,000 Americans dead, millions of allies, tens of millions of civilians, cities reduced to rubble, entire nations traumatized beyond healing. He visited the concentration camps. Nothing had prepared him for Buchenwald, the living skeletons, the mass graves, the ovens. He had known intellectually what the Nazis were doing. Intelligence reports had described the Holocaust. But seeing it, smelling it, touching the evidence of systematic evil, that was different. He ordered every unit in the area to tour the camps. He brought journalists and photographers. "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," he said. "Now at least he will know what he is fighting against." The victory parades felt hollow. Ticker tape in New York, crowds in London, medals and honors from grateful nations. But Eisenhower couldn't forget the faces of the dead, the paratroopers who never made it to their drop zones, the tankers who burned alive in their Shermans, the medics shot while trying to save lives. Every cheering crowd reminded him of those who weren't there to hear the cheers. Every medal felt like it belonged to someone who hadn't made it home. He returned to Normandy one last time before leaving Europe. The temporary cemeteries were becoming permanent. White crosses and stars of David stretching in perfect rows. The American cemetery above Omaha Beach would hold over 9,000 dead. Each marker represented not just a life lost, but a decision he had made. He had sent these men to their deaths, that they had died for freedom, that their sacrifice had meaning. This was his only consolation. But consolation and absolution were different things. Late at night, in the silence of his study, the ghosts would visit. They always would. History would remember Eisenhower as the architect of D-Day, the supreme commander who had managed the impossible, coordinating the alliance that defeated Nazi Germany. Future generals would study his leadership. Historians would praise his political skills in managing difficult personalities like Montgomery and Patton. His face would appear on coins and stamps. Schools and highways would bear his name. He would become president, leading America through 8 years of peace and prosperity. But he would never forget that morning in Portsmouth. The weight of the pen, the trembling hand, the knowledge that with one decision he was sending thousands to their deaths. This was the burden that never left him. In quiet moments walking the grounds of his farm in Gettysburg, he would remember, not the glory or the parades, but the cost. The boys who had trusted him, the families he had shattered, the necessity of it all, and the tragedy. Leadership, he learned, wasn't about being right. It was about accepting responsibility for being wrong. It was about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. It was about sending men to die and honoring their sacrifice by never forgetting why they died. Every leader who followed would face their own D-Day, a moment when the fate of many rested on the decision of one. And in that moment, they would discover what Eisenhower knew. That command is not a privilege, but a burden. Not an honor, but a duty. The boys from Kansas had become the liberator of Europe, but he never stopped being the son of Ida Eisenhower, the pacifist who taught him that every life was precious. Perhaps that's why he was the right man for that moment. Because he never forgot the cost. Because every order that sent men to their deaths wounded him. Because he understood that victory in war was always a tragedy, just a lesser tragedy than defeat. Today, when you visit the beaches of Normandy, you can still see the remnants. Concrete bunkers slowly being reclaimed by sand. Rusted obstacles revealed at low tide. And above it all, the cemetery where 9,387 Americans rest, facing west toward home. They were farmers and factory workers, teachers and store clerks. They had dreams and fears, loves and hopes. They gave it all up on June 6, 1944, because one man made a decision in the darkness before dawn. Remember them. Remember him. Remember that freedom is never free, and that sometimes in the darkest hours, ordinary people must do extraordinary things. Remember that leadership sometimes means sending heroes to their deaths and living with that burden forever. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel, and if you have a family member who served, who sacrificed, who carried their own burdens home from war, share their story in the comments below. Because this channel exists to ensure that their courage, like Eisenhower's burden, is never forgotten. We tell these stories not to glorify war, but to honor those who stood against tyranny when the world needed them